This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This summer, Instacart presents famous summer flavors coming to your front door. Or pool. Or hotel.
Your grocery delivery has arrived, sir.
That was faster than room service.
No violins in the lobby.
Oh, seriously? Anyway, sit back, relax, and get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes. Starring your favorite snacks, drinks, and more. Download Instacart for free delivery on your first 3 orders. Rated H for hungry audiences. Offer valid for a limited time. Minimum $10 per order. Excludes restaurants. Additional terms and fees apply.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Food addiction. Is it a real thing? That's the question for this edition of the Food Programme. Have a listen. See what you think.
I see it as a very serious addiction. I think that an addiction has got 2 parts to it, the physical and the mental. Physically, when I put certain substances in my body craves them more, and other people don't always have that, you know.
Other diets that I've been on before allow for some element of moderation, but I've learned that part of this story of being an addict is that we can't fully moderate like other people can. So I don't think I could have 1 biscuit. I'd probably want half a packet at least.
It's just booze but food. The addiction is identical. The secrecy of consuming these things, the shame behind it. And food is a tricky one because booze and drugs, you can just give up. Unbelievably difficult, but a zero tolerance policy. Whereas if you're addicted to food or to love or all these things that are sustaining, you still have to have them. And so it's quite a hard one to work your way out of.
A hard one to work your way out of. That lost voice was Richard Osman's on Desert Island Discs a few years ago. At the time, people talked about his bravery, speaking so publicly about his struggles with overeating. What few questioned was the addiction, he claims, not something recognised by the NHS or any other health authority. I'm Sheila Dillon, and in this edition of the Food Programme, I'm going to hear from some people who think it's time food addiction was recognised officially, and some who think the science isn't yet there to back that up.
I'm Dr Jen Unwin, and I'm a clinical psychologist.
Dr Jen Unwin is one of the clinicians in the UK who believes food addiction is a measurable, serious problem. She links her scientific understanding with her own lifelong difficulties with food.
Typical things for me would have been, anything sweet. So cake, chocolate, sweets, donuts, commercial pizzas, but also things that other people might consider real whole foods. So pasta, I could massively overeat.
You wrote a very powerful article in I think it was the Daily Telegraph, and you were saying as a child you remember scones, not necessarily sugary things then.
Yes, I think only been about 4 or 5, and this is pretty typical of the people we see with food addiction, that it does start very young. I've been sent to Sunday school and we'd made some cheese scones. It's very early memory of just wanting to eat a lot. So it's not sweet foods, but of course we all know refined carbohydrates do break down very quickly into glucose.
How would you explain to someone who'd never come across this notion before what it's like to be a food addict?
I've never had another addiction actually, but I describe it because people tend to have known someone with an alcohol problem, or they've seen it on the television. They understand that people have cravings and compulsions that they sort of can't control. So even though logically they know that substance is doing them harm, they still find themselves reaching for it, even though their best intentions are not to do that. And then hobbies, family, outings, work, all of those things sort of pale into insignificance, really, because they're obsessed with getting the substance. So the brain is very preoccupied. And that's what people describe.
You'd say this was a description of you before you changed your eating habits?
Yes, so I worked in the NHS, biscuits everywhere and cakes everywhere. So someone would offer you a biscuit mid-morning and you were a little bit hungry, so you'd have one, but then that would trigger off, could I sneak another one? Or maybe I'll just nip down to the Smith's that's now in the foyer of the hospital and have something else. And then I'd bought this healthy lunch, but now I don't want the healthy lunch. I'm going to go to the canteen. And obviously there's the feelings of regret and remorse. And of course, for me as a psychologist, it was doubly flummoxing because I was ashamed that I couldn't control this behaviour. And as a psychologist, that's what I'm all about, is helping people with their behavioural problems. So until I finally understood it was never my fault, it was an addiction, I just had that kind of brain that would easily get wired for addiction, then I knew what to do about it.
So Dr. Unwin approached her eating problem like any other addict wanting to get clean, through abstinence. Of course, you'll die if you abstain from all foods. She stopped eating whatever brought on the urge to eat more and more and more. Now she and a group of other clinicians working on this have all agreed that the addictive foods, the most problematic ones, are those that have been ultra-processed, UPF foods. That's the much debated category of foods defined in the NOVA classification system as industrial formulations made entirely or mostly from substances extracted from foods, derived from food constituents, or synthesized in laboratories from food substrate or other organic sources. They're also mostly high in sugar, salt, and fat, not a combination ever found in nature. We'll come back to the UPF addiction question shortly, but first, let's hear from someone Dr. Unwin has been working with. 48-year-old Sharon Harvey from Southport says she's been battling with her weight all her life. In December last year, she weighed 21.9 stones and was finding moving around more and more difficult. But her GP is Dr. David Unwin, Jen's husband. He was the one who told her that she might fit the criteria for food addiction.
He said some very important words, really, that stuck with me. He said, "It's not your fault, but it is your problem to deal with." And that really resonated. I thought, well, I've never been told it's not my fault before. How can it not be my fault? Obviously, I'm the one that's overeaten. I'm the one that's kind of got myself into this situation.
Sharon had been on countless failed diets, but that's changed since that December conversation with her GP. 8 months on, she's lost 4.5 stone. But the important thing seems to be that the diagnosis changed her mindset.
I really struggled with it at first. I thought, don't be ridiculous. If I'm addicted to food and addicted to sugar, then so's everyone else. But I started to kind of really process it and think, well, actually, I kind of was obsessed with cake, really, and obsessed with chocolate and obsessed with a lot of sweet, starchy, sugary foods that I knew were not doing me any good. Classing it as an addiction has really helped. It's been able to let my brain sort of say, well, you don't eat those things anymore. And it's not just those that I've had to eliminate. Unfortunately, the minute that your body kind of gets potatoes or rice or pasta or bread, that's also taken in as sugar from your body. So I've just had to go for that complete low-carb approach. Meat, fish, salad, vegetables. If I fancy something sweet, I have berries. As much as I struggled with it at first, the diagnosis has actually really helped me to cut out all things that I should have probably cut out years ago.
And how has it changed your mindset and the way you feel about yourself?
I used to think of myself as a complete and utter failure because I knew this gets me a bit emotional really, but every diet that I tried, I could never actually sustain. I'd lose a little bit of weight at first, but then the cravings were just too strong. It's only actually processing it as an addiction that's been able to help me shed this weight.
What about your physical health?
It's much improved. I can walk for a lot longer. I can sustain my energy levels at work. I've still got a lot of weight to lose, but I try and remind myself how far I've come. I just wish there was a little bit more awareness and a bit of understanding around it, because Would I choose to put myself on such a strict diet? Obviously not, no. But I realise now that it's a necessity.
Sharon Harvey, speaking to producer Natalie Donovan. The term food addiction was first used in the 1950s. Since then, there's been a lot of research, but it's never been confirmed as a disorder or disease in the way that drugs or alcohol, tobacco, gambling and gaming have. So there's no approved treatment or diagnosis guidelines. Dr. Jen Unwin again.
Obviously, the diagnosis of food addiction is not an official diagnosis. There isn't one. That's why we're campaigning, and we've made one submission which was rejected. We're going to make another submission to the WHO.
The World Health Organization.
Until it's recognised, there's unlikely to be funding for research and treatment.
How many people do you think are food addicts in the UK?
So if we look at the published studies, and these tend to be using a questionnaire called the Yale Food Addiction Scale, they think you're looking about 10% of the general population. I think it's probably higher. It's a massive and growing problem because of the impacts it's having on mental and physical health. And of course, this is also why it's extremely concerning that young people are eating so much ultra-processed food, because they're at the stage when their brains are very plastic, they're wiring their brains for addiction. They will also be susceptible to other addictions.
Dr. Jen Unwin. The Health Survey for England in 2021 estimated that around 25% of adults in England are obese and a further 37.9% are overweight. But, as Dr. Unwin says, we should remember that not all overweight people are addicted to food and not all food addicts are overweight. Earlier this year, Jen and some like-minded colleagues organised a conference to bring together a group of international clinicians and researchers to see if they could develop a consensus on whether food really could be scientifically classified as addictive.
Thank you, Steve, for those very kind words. I must say I'm standing very
Dr Chris Van Tulleken was the opening speaker.
And I want to make the case to you.
He's a scientist and broadcaster who's written about the concept of food addiction in his best-selling book, Ultra-Processed People. Why do we all eat stuff that isn't food, and why can't we stop? We caught up with him on a coffee break.
The public don't like having addictive substances being unregulated. We all agree that we need to regulate gambling, tobacco, illicit drugs. There's wide public support for that. And there is also a lot of public support. If you just go and ask people whether they find food addictive, the answer is very often yes. And so I think regulating the food will A, be good for those people, but B, it's then really, really important because the same food that we know drives addiction also drives all these other health harms. So by putting warning labels on it, having public health campaigns, perhaps progressive taxation on the worst products, we help everyone.
But why just UPF? Both Sharon's and Jen's cravings are also triggered by pasta, rice and potatoes, well, cooked in certain ways.
Ultra-processed food is physiologically discretionary, which means you don't need it for your body. Now, in reality, many people do need it. It's the only affordable available food for millions of people in this country. But it is theoretically possible to be abstinent for it. So that's a really important part of the definition. So I think that ultra-processed food addiction is the direction of travel we should be heading in.
Many of the people involved in the conference have a personal experience with what they call addiction. One was speaker Dr. Susan Pearce-Thompson, Professor of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at the University of Rochester in the United States. She's a best-selling author and founder of weight loss company Bright Line Eating.
I started using drugs when I was 14 years old. I graduated to using crystal meth when I was 16, and I was addicted to crack cocaine later as a teenager, and I spent some time being a prostitute and a crack addict and a high school dropout. So not just a little bit of drug use, but quite serious addiction. I got clean when I was 20, so I'm coming up on 30 years of complete sobriety from all drugs and alcohol. And food addiction took over my life very quickly after I quit using drugs. And I did find that food recovery is harder than drug recovery. It's not that the high is better, because the dopamine response from a donut is not as strong as the dopamine response from crack cocaine, although it's actually higher than you might think. It's up there with nicotine and with alcohol, for example. But what I find harder is that when food is your drug, there's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. When I quit using crack cocaine, I had a whole world to return to, whereas when food is your drug of choice, people don't understand. They harass you for quote-unquote dieting on a holiday when you say, no thanks, I don't eat sugar. So your whole day is basically a conditioned reinforcer, one after the other, to relapse.
So what does she think of redefining food addiction as an ultra-processed food addiction?
When we define ultra-processed food addiction as a disease, now we have huge regulatory ability to say, well, if ultra-processed foods are addictive, we can't advertise them to children, we can't have them in preschools, and we start to really get at a prevention-type solution. And what we need to do ultimately is not addict people in the first place. Now, once someone has a highly advanced food addiction, abstaining from ultra-processed foods is not enough. I mean, someone can sit down with a jar of walnuts and a jar of raisins and eat the whole thing, and that's going to be problematic. So it's not that ultra-processed foods are the only foods that are addictive, but ultra-processed foods are the gateway. And so this is why it's absolutely the right way to go.
Some of the objections by the WHO or DSM are quite strange because we're talking about creating a diagnostic category. And if you want to find out whether someone is addicted to something, you don't need to put them in a brain scanner or do a blood test. You ask them a set of questions. And the questions at heart are very simple. It's, do you have a relationship where you keep using a substance or you keep enacting a behaviour that you know does you physical, psychological, social harm, despite trying to quit? And if the answer is you keep using it, then that's the beginning of an addicted relationship. Now, we can grade it using more sophisticated questions, but that's how we screen and diagnose addiction.
Dr Chris Van Tulleken, and before him, Dr Susan Pearce-Thompson from the University of Rochester. Sitting all day listening and watching, it was easy to be overtaken by the research on addiction and the claims being made for it. From brain imaging scans showing how UPFs manipulate brain functions, to conversations about dopamine's involvement. And then there were the arguments for total abstinence from trigger foods being the only way to put the addiction into remission. Although all the speakers agreed that UPF was a central part of the problem, they also agreed that some other foods could be problematic, and it's up to individuals to understand what drives their own compulsions. Within the walls of the conference room, the consensus felt strong. But outside, there are skeptics. Dr. Margaret Westwater is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford, and she's currently a lab associate at Yale University's School of Medicine, from where she spoke to me. Her specialism is the neurobiology of disordered eating, including the brain-gut connection.
When animals are given free access to things like heroin or cocaine, they develop drug binging very quickly. But we only see this with sugar when it's under very specific experimental conditions that are called intermittent access to sugar. So this means that the rodent is actually deprived of food for 12 to sometimes 16 hours. And it is only in those instances that they develop this binge-like pattern of consumption, which really is important because it actually suggests that restricting food intake for the animal is what's starting to drive the increase in sugar consumption. The second thing is animals will go through these very unpleasant things to increase their seeking, and they will work harder to get the drugs. We don't see that for sugar. So if you pair sugar with a bitter substance or a foot shock, the rodent will give up.
She says the models also show a lower dopamine response to sugar in the brains of rats and less of a withdrawal response. But as she also says, these studies were only with sugar, rather than the highly palatable foods that seem to be a problem in human diets. Very few people gorge on pure sugar. So what more is needed to call these addiction-like behaviours a real addiction?
Patients all have their own narratives of what their subjective experience and lived experience of their condition is. And they can be very helpful to folks. But as scientists, we have to hold ourselves to a different standard when we're using these terms like addiction and substance use disorders. We need to hold our feet to the fire and use the evidence that we have. And at this point in time, there have been many studies that are looking for evidence of sugar addiction, looking for evidence of food addiction, and they have not generated it. So for my professional opinion, we do not have evidence to support the use of this phrase in the scientific community or to introduce it into any sort of diagnostic manuals.
Does it concern you that this focus on this idea of food addiction, might harm in some way people who have the already scientifically recognized food eating disorders, such as anorexia nervosa, but there are many others?
Yeah, it is a concern that when we label various foods as addictive or toxic or ultra-processed or all of these very negative terms, that it can create these very unhelpful beliefs and fears about foods that can drive altered eating patterns and restriction. And one thing that we know is that when we label these foods as something that must be avoided and can make us think about it more, paradoxically, and potentially, lead to this pattern and cycle of binge eating. So one thing that we talk about in the eating disorder field is really trying to think of always and sometimes foods as opposed to just labeling things with these very evocative phrases.
Dr. Maggie Westwater. If the science is not there proving that any one food ingredient is addictive, perhaps we're asking the wrong scientific questions. I went to talk to Professor Barry Smith, Director of the Institute of Philosophy at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London and founding Director of the Centre for the Study of the Senses. The centre brings together research from philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists.
I think it's very clever. I think industrially processed, advanced design of food is trying to provide something to our senses which we find compelling, delicious, desirable. We maybe want to eat it. We maybe want to eat more of it. But we're not going to talk about why we're so compelled to go on eating it just by reducing it to the level of a single nutrient and trying to pin all the blame on that. It's the sensory enhancement effect of it. It's the way in which all those ingredients together might bluff our system. It's the way our brains respond to the signals from our tongue. And also, it's what's available, what's affordable, as does the advertising, the marketing.
Earlier this year, Professor Smith gave evidence to the House of Lords Committee on Food, Diet and Obesity, and after the evidence session, led the committee members through a tasting to demonstrate how the processing and mixing of ingredients creates that unmistakable but hard to define urge to eat more and more and more. So today, I'm in his tasting lab for a rerun.
So Sheila, first thing I want you to try is this. This is your regular Coke, ice cold, fizzy.
I quite like it. Refreshing?
Yes. Now contrast that with the warmer, flatter one.
Well,
I can see by your face.
It's unpleasant.
It's unpleasant.
It's much, much more sugary.
Here's a vehicle by processing alone to create a delivery system that gets you to ingest more sugar than the taste receptors in your mouth can bear, and yet you've ingested exactly what we've just given you when you try it flat and warm.
So what is it that is bypassing my sense of I'm drinking too much sugar?
So because you've got those CO2 bubbles, they are pure trigeminal nerve stimulants. That's the fifth cranial nerve. It's the one that rings bells when you have too much wasabi and you get the feeling at the bridge of your nose. But what it does is it suppresses sweetness and accentuates sourness. But coldness also brings out bitterness. So you get a little more sourness, a little more bitterness, and now it seems like a perfectly rounded, nice, harmonious drink.
Next, Professor Smith brought out 2 big bags of tortilla chips.
One is a plain tortilla chip, and let's look at the ingredients list, and it's really quite impressive because it says made from maize flour, vegetable oils, and salt. Have a go at that, Sheila.
Lovely. You can taste the corn.
Okay, now we're going to get you to taste a Dorito.
They smell vinegary. And the texture is much the same. You can't taste the corn. Well, you can actually at the very end. I'll have another.
The reason you can't taste the corn till the end is because you're just getting assaulted with all that flavouring powder. It's only when that dissipates that you get down to the tortilla chip itself.
Well, it's very powerful, very, very tasty, very...
It's intense.
Punchy. Very punchy.
Very intense.
I'm having another. This is the third one.
So let me just have a run through what's in there. Corn, rapeseed oil, original flavourings, contains milk, salt, glucose syrup, sugar, onion powder, potassium chloride, malic acid, sodium acetate, citric acid. Colour is annatto, bixin, milk protein, forel, rich extract, citric acid. Quite a lot in there.
I'd say, boy.
It's quite a mouthful.
Well, that goes back to what you were saying earlier. A lot of nutritional scientists and certainly the food industry want to say, well, show me the ingredient that's addictive. What can you say?
It's sort of scientifically naive to think we'll just have one culprit. It can be the combination of these ingredients and the way they've been very carefully balanced, the proportions of them, to develop certain sensory responses in us that tell the brain we're getting something very good, we need to keep consuming it, but we're sending signals, for example, with the glutamates and the nucleotides that we're getting lots of protein, sending a signal for something that never comes. So we're actually bluffing our system. And it could be that we go on eating them, trying to extract those nutrients, and they're simply not there. Also, the ratios of fat and carbohydrate that make them hyper-palatable have got a very unintended, perhaps, but certainly worrying side effect. They slow down our satiety response. I mean, if I keep feeding you the ordinary tortilla chips, Sheila, there'll be a moment where you say, I've had enough. And if I say the experiment must continue and I keep feeding you them, they're going to be pretty unpleasant. That's sensory-specific satiety. But these chips are particular combinations of ingredients which bypass or slow down that reaction. That's a very, very bad thing if we're looking at the issue of addictive behaviour.
I think I must be one of those people who is prone to addiction because actually I don't particularly like these, but if I bought something like that, I'd have to wrap up the bag and put clip on it and put it in the cupboard and close the door to stop eating them. So my question to you is, how conscious is the food industry? I mean, you've been involved with the food industry. You've taken money from the food industry, I gather. How conscious are they of creating this more effect?
Well, I think we have to be nuanced and careful here. It's very worrying that everybody breaks into a very polarised debate of food industry terribly bad and there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. I mean, I think they start out with good intentions. They want to make food available. They want to make it last longer in stores. They use cheaper ingredients, but they also have to enhance what they're using to make it have those powerful flavour properties. But once we know it's actually producing a response in us that bypasses our intake regulation mechanisms and has us wanting to have more and more than we know we should have, the more they talk about, oh, how can we make these chips irresistible? Or aren't they moreish? Which is a much nicer word than addiction. Then I think if they know they're doing that, they're really part of the problem. And, we need to have responsibility from the food industry at that point.
Philosopher and sensory expert Professor Barry Smith at the University of London. We contacted the companies who make Doritos and Coca-Cola, but only Doritos responded. They told us, Doritos wouldn't be Doritos without the bold flavours and great taste. We know that balance is important, and we've worked hard to develop new, non-high-fat sugar and salt options, such as Doritos Dippers. The Food and Drink Federation, the trade organisation that represents Coca-Cola and Doritos and many more companies, told us that millions of pounds have been invested over the past decade in making recipes healthier by reducing fat, salt and sugar and adding fibre. You can hear more about this in our programme Reformulation, a fix for the obesity crisis, which is still available on BBC Sounds. The Food and Drink Federation also added,
food processing plays a central role in our food safety, security, and in preventing food waste. It also helps people making healthier choices by enabling, for example, low-calorie options alongside allergen-free or plant-based alternatives, and options for busy working families. The food industry is following the debate around UPF very closely, However, as the government's Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition has noted, while many observational studies link UPF with poor health outcomes, there are significant and important gaps in the evidence base. We are reassured that the government has commissioned further studies and hope this will bring scientific clarity.
Back at the Food Addiction Conference, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Michael Moss has just come off the stage. His most recent book is Hooked: How We Became Addicted to Processed Food.
I've been crawling through the underbelly of the processed food industry for a decade, so I just wanted to sort of share what people at this conference are up against in terms of the food industry's drive to maximize the allure of their products and the enormous resources that companies put into getting us not just to like their products, but to want more and more. I mean, we've gotten to a point now for every dollar we spend on processed food, we're having to shell out another dollar to fix those troubles, whether it's health problems, lost productivity in the workplace. And we and the government are sort of having to shoulder that hidden price of processed food.
On stage, Michael Moss had also been talking about the research of psychologist and neuroscientist Dr. Dana Small, looking at the ways that she says ultra-processed foods hijack our biology.
Yeah, I was kind of referring to the work that Dana Small has done reframing our trouble with food as a situation where these companies are exploiting kind of our deepest biology. Because if you think about it, for most of our existence, overeating was a really good thing. It enabled you to put on body fat and survive. And as Dana sort of points out, it's really only in the last 50 years that these companies have so dramatically changed the nature of our food environment to make overeating an everyday thing. And so she points to our natural attraction to food based on cheapness, right? And so that's why you have the food companies using chemical labs, flavor labs, to reformulate their products to reduce the cost, knowing that if we walk into the grocery store and that box of toaster pastries costs 15 cents less, we're innately going to get excited about that. And she draws those parallels to things like the variety that companies build into their products, knowing that we are by nature attracted to variety.
Journalist and author Michael Moss. Abstinence as the central treatment for addiction must be tough to put into practice, but it's been used for a long time by members of Overeaters Anonymous, some of whom were in the audience. Like Alcoholics Anonymous, they used the 12 steps as their guide. Afterwards, we arranged to speak to Rosie, not her real name, who's been a member of Overeaters Anonymous for almost 30 years.
I started going in January 95. I was about 37 then. I'd spent a lot of my life failing to control what I ate, therefore my weight was up. I came in obese. It was devastating to me that I couldn't manage it, and I tried lots of things. One minute I'd be on the diet doing what I was told, and literally a switch would happen. And I'd just have to binge. I'd have to overeat. Sugar, chocolatey stuff, all that stuff, you know.
We recorded this interview over a video call. Rosie is a middle-aged woman and she looked very fit and healthy.
I don't eat cake, chocolate, sugary stuff, any of that. I don't eat much white bread. I don't think white bread is an addictive thing for me. I just don't eat it very often unless I can't get anything better.
Your experience of being in Overeaters Anonymous meetings, do you get a sense that most people are having trouble with the same foods that you have trouble with?
That could be true. I mean, a lot of people in OA don't eat processed sugary stuff in recovery. But I think that there is a broad range with the eating problem. You know, like if you're an alcoholic, it's alcohol. But for a lot of us foodies, different people do binge on different things.
Do you still have cravings for the foods that you gave up a long time ago?
No, I don't. Abstinence, I see it as almost like a muscle. And over the years, my muscle has got stronger. And I wouldn't want to give it up anyway, the life I have, just for the ability to eat an ice cream now and then is crackers to me today. And anyway, the truth is, I wouldn't be able to enjoy an ice cream now and then because I don't have that type of brain or whatever that is that can do that. You know, I'm an all or nothing person when it comes to ice cream, you know.
Would it help if food addiction was recognised at an official level, World Health Organization, for example?
It might do. You know, of all the addictions, it's not taken terribly seriously. It's a very socially acceptable addiction.
An acceptable addiction? In modern times, there's really not been much sympathy for anyone who can't control their eating. They're usually accused of lacking willpower. The new understanding about that other power, the power of intensely flavoured industrial foods to create a longing for more, is turning that sneering attitude on its head, and help toward recovery is developing. Dr. Jen Unwin helps run residential courses to help people learn about and manage what she firmly defines as food addiction. There's also a new company using AI to support people with what they see as addictive problems around food. The support is developed via a commercial app called Juniver, set up with researchers at King's College London. They aim to support people with eating disorders while collecting data to build better treatments. Its founder and CEO is Emily Four. Producer Natalie Donovan went to meet her and try out the app.
We've trained an AI model to deliver really supportive, helpful, and empowering messages. So we've trained this model with our clinicians and people with lived experience and benchmarked it against what a clinician with a focus on eating disorders would tell you if you were in the room with them. The challenge is that urges occur really often outside of therapy appointments. And so helping people in the moment, whether that's, if they're staring down their refrigerator at midnight on a Saturday or walking into a birthday party with their child and the cake starts vibing in your mind, all of these moments, we help people through them in a way that is in a way your therapist in your pocket.
Okay, well, let's have a look at the app. I've got it on my phone. I wonder if I just said I really want to eat the chocolate eclairs that are in the fridge.
Yeah, do that.
So I'm going to just tap it in. I really want to eat. Oh, here we are. So, Junie says, cravings for specific foods like chocolate eclairs can be strong, and it's okay to acknowledge that desire. In recovery, occasional indulgence in foods you enjoy can be part of a healthy approach to eating. Here's what we can do. 1, allow yourself the eclair without guilt, savouring each bite mindfully. 2, if you're worried about overeating, set a portion that feels comfortable for you, such as 1 eclair, and then take a moment after to check in with yourself and your body's signals. So that's really interesting. It's not telling me to step away from the fridge and put the eclair to the back of my mind and go out for a walk, which I was kind of expecting it to.
Yeah. And that's because the objective with recovery from disordered eating is freedom from often restriction.
But some people working in this field say that you can't moderate with a food addiction. You disagree with that?
That's right. We know that removing food groups entirely is often not helpful in eradicating binge eating. So if it works for you, great. We advocate something slightly different, which is to learn how to trust yourself so that you can include foods in moderation and have a better quality of life.
And that includes ultra-processed foods.
Ultra-processed foods are a really hard thing to consume because they are designed to trigger that overconsumption. So with ultra-processed food, it might put people in a vulnerable position. And so not having them, for example, in your kitchen cupboard at the early stages of your recovery is probably advisable. And then looking to reincorporate them so that if you were to be offered a pack of Doritos, then great, do it. You're in a place where that feels more feasible without any risk of triggering a binge.
So you see food addiction as a curable problem, that someone who thinks that they have a food addiction can moderate foods that they find problematic. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a compulsion. It's a similar situation in other addictions where if you quit smoking by no longer lighting up enough times to quit wanting to light up. Our program is built on the same premise, which is to say, if you overcome your urge to binge enough times, you'll gradually see that the urges are decreasing in intensity and frequency, and eventually they'll stop coming.
Emily Four from Juniver. But we're now in the era of anti-obesity drugs, Ozempic and the like. Doesn't their existence make all worries about addiction a bit of a side issue? I asked Dr. Jen Unwin.
We don't really know what the long-term outcomes are going to be. There are some side effects, some of them reasonably serious. And also, once people stop taking them, that all the problems come back, because you haven't really treated the addictive component of the problem. Those drugs are going to help people with cravings. That's the main way that they reduce your hunger enormously. So I would say it may be useful for people who really struggle with abstinence to get a period of abstinence and then convert their diet into a much healthier whole food diet, a bit like methadone would be to heroin. It's to help you get off the heroin so that then you can get off the methadone and be drug free. And I would potentially see that there could be some uses for people with severe food addiction to have the Wegovy as a sort of stepping stone.
So what are the next steps? Dr. Unwin and her colleagues haven't yet put in their new submission to the World Health Organization to have ultra-processed food addiction added to the list of recognised disorders after their first submission was rejected in 2021. We asked WHO to take part in this programme, but they didn't respond. One of the complexities is the category. Ultra-processed food now includes a lot of foods. Roughly 2/3 of a British teenager's diet right now is ultra-processed. And then there's the difficulty of those who say that their addiction is also triggered by less industrially made foods such as scones, cakes, fried potatoes. But what is unquestionable is that as UPF foods have spread around the globe, what always develops alongside is obesity, the chronic diseases that follow in obesity's wake, and strong patterns of disordered eating. And what seems increasingly clear in the UK is that the public can see the harm industrial food is doing and want it curbed. This week, a survey for the Health Foundation showed that 59% of the public want junk food companies to be taxed and the money used to provide fruit and vegetables for low-income families. We asked the Department of Health and Social Care if anyone there is working on the idea of food addiction as a diagnosis. It told us,
"This government will take action to prevent ill health and tackle the obesity crisis head-on, erasing the strain on the NHS and helping people to live well for longer. We will introduce tight restrictions on advertising junk food, alongside banning children from being able to purchase sugary, high-caffeine energy drinks. In addition, through our National Institute for Health and Care Research, we are commissioning research to improve the evidence on health impacts of ultra-processed foods."
So, is food addiction a real thing? If so, what's the role of ultra-processed food in it? Can all this sickness and unhappiness on show at the conference be pinned on the giant corporations at play in the global food market? Does personal responsibility have no role? And what's the connection between what we see with our own eyes, feel in our own bodies, and the scientific research, which still seems to major on a search for those one or two bad ingredients that will explain all difficulties? Well, some final thoughts from Dr. Chris Van Tulleken.
The lived experience of people listening to the food programme is some of them will think this is ridiculous, but a great many people will be like, yes, of course, I can't stop using particular foods. My question to those people who recognise this problem in themselves is to say, what are those foods? Is it your homemade lasagna? Is it a cake you baked yourself? Or is it packaged goods that are marketed to you and that are produced in factories? And the answer is almost always the latter. Lived experience is really, really important. If people say they're addicted, then that is basically how we define addiction.
Producer Natalie Donovan and I hope you enjoyed this edition of the food programme. She produced it at BBC Bristol.
In December 1969, Muriel Mackay vanished from her London home.
We have your wife. It will cost you £1 million to get her back.
Two men, targeting Rupert Murdoch's wife Anna, had abducted Muriel by mistake. It was the first high-profile kidnapping in British history, and the tabloid press were hooked.
Was she alive? Was she dead?
The police were baffled.
It's the most hideous crime, kidnapping. It's worse than just a straight murder.
And Muriel's family was thrown into a nightmare that continues to this day.
I just want to find my mother's body.
I'm Jane McSorley, and this is Intrigue, Worse Than Murder. Listen on BBC Sounds.
Hey
everyone. This is Molly and Matt, and we're the hosts of Grown Up Stuff How to Adult, a podcast from Ruby Studio and iHeart Podcasts.
It's a show dedicated to helping you figure out the trickiest parts of adulting.
Like how to start planning for retirement, creating a healthy skincare routine, understanding when and how much to tip someone, and so much more.
Let's learn about all of it and then some. Listen to Grown Up Stuff How to Adult on America's #1 podcast network, iHeart. Open your free iHeart app and search Grown Up Stuff.
Grown Up Stuff.